A graphic equalizer is basically the same as the tone control system that we've already looked at, but instead of just 2 or 3 tone controls, bass, middle and treble, we might have 6, 7, 10 or even 31 different tone controls, all at different frequency points. And instead of knobs, they're placed next to each other as a bunch of sliders. The lower frequencies are at the left, and they move progressively higher as we move to the right. So we basically have a graphical representation of the bass sound moving from the bass through the mids and up through the treble. And that visual way of looking at it can be really useful for getting an idea of which frequency lies in which part of our sound. The advantages of a graphic EQ over a simple tone control system that we've already looked at are pretty obvious. It's simply more specific. A bass control knob might be centered around 40 Hz and have a big 1.5 octave spread of bandwidth, that it's going to affect. But on a graphic EQ, we can boost or cut specific regions that are assigned to the bands or sliders. The more sliders that we have, the more specific we can be. In a PA system, this can be really useful for getting rid of unwanted sounds like feedback at certain frequencies. And for us bass players, we might want to boost a frequency around something like 80 Hz without having so much effect on the lower 40 Hz area. A simple tone control is more generalized and it won't allow that. It just boosts a load of the bass frequencies in one bulk area. So as I said, the graphic EQ is a lot more specific. Graphic equalizers can be found in pretty much all PA rack systems, but they can also be found on quite a few bass amps, and you can also buy them as effects pedals. So let's have a look at this graphic EQ pedal. So this is a bass equalizer by Boss, and it's a 7-band graphic EQ, and that's because we have 7 frequency sliders. Here we have the frequencies 50, 120, 400, 500, 800 and then up to 4.5 and 10 kilohertz. So the bass frequencies are down here at 50 and 120, and then we've got a bunch of mid frequencies from 400 up to 800, and then the treble frequencies are up at the 4.5 and 10 kilohertz. So this is basically the same as having 7 tone controls that you might label deep bass, bass, low mid, mid, high mid, etc. But that would obviously be a bit silly. It's much better to know what the frequencies are, what they sound like and how they can affect our place in a mix. And getting some practice with a graphic EQ can really help with this. So let's have a look at how the sliders on the graphic EQ can change the sound of the bass. So I'm just going to run a bass groove through the looper again. And I'll just boost each one in turn. So the first one we have is 50 Hz. So this is a low bass sound. So let's try that. Okay, so you can hear how it's got a bit boomy, just as we did with the amp when we boosted the bass tone controls. So let's bring that down again. If I was to drop that right down, again, we lose a lot of the boom and quite a bit of the warmth. Okay, so back up to flat. Okay, so now let's boost the next one, 120. Okay, so I'm up to there and it's getting, pretty boomy there. So that's a very low mid sound, or sort of higher bass sound. So bring it down again, flat, and all the way down. Again, we lose a lot of the sound there. Now let's try 400. That's a very mid kind of sound, okay? So again, drop it down, drop it out. And we're getting there a little bit more of that kind of scooped sound where we get rid of the mids there. So it's a lot rounder. Now 500. Now we're getting more into the honky territory. Drop it down. Okay, so again, that round sound. Now 800. So that again, we're in that honky territory and it's getting up into the more into the treble kind of zone. If I was to boost up the 500 as well, we're really getting a lot of that honk going on. Okay, and back. If I dropped those down, really round sound, not much definition in there at all. And that's the kind of sound that a lot of people like to try and get because it's a very forgiving sound. But the problem is we don't have any body to it, and that's where the problems lie. If you tried playing in a band with that kind of sound, you could get lost in the mix. Okay, so there's a bit more character in there. Now 4.5 kilohertz. Okay, so now you can start hearing a little bit more of the sound of the fingers and stuff. That's treble. And 10 kilohertz. And that's fairly out of the range of the bass. It's only affecting the fret noise, the finger movement. Let's boost the 4.5 as well. Again, it's very high treble. Okay? So that's a graphic EQ, but there's also another type of EQ that we can use that I've already mentioned in passing, and that's the parametric EQ. A parametric uses knobs rather than sliders, and it can be much more specific in finding a specific frequency. With graphic EQs and standard tone controls, the frequencies are set, and then we can boost or cut them. On the graphic EQ pedal, we had 50, 120, 140, and they were set there. We can't just decide that we want to affect 55 Hz or 670 Hz. We only have what's provided. On a parametric EQ, we can set the frequency ourselves. So we generally have a knob for setting the frequency and then a separate knob for the amount that we want to cut or boost. So it's a bit like having a customized graphic where we can change the numbers to suit the situation. As well as the frequency and boost cut knob, a proper fully parametric EQ will also have a knob or switch for setting the bandwidth to be affected. A semi-parametric EQ doesn't have this, so the bandwidth is already set. Now, because parametrics are much more specific in the way that we use them, they generally don't have as many bands. So the EQ pedal had 7 separate frequency bands, whereas a parametric might only have 1 band, or it might have 3 bands, like customizable bass, mid and treble. Or studio parametrics might have a few more, but it's not really the same as using a graphic. The graphic gives us a more general overview of the shape of the sound, even though we can, be fairly specific with certain areas. The parametric is much more specific and for really addressing certain problems or situations, so you'll find a very specific frequency and then alter it. So here we have an Artec parametric equalizer, and the 2 main controls to be aware of are the frequency selector, which is this one on the right, and that's for selecting the frequency that we want, and the gain control that's in the middle there, and that's the amount of boost or cut that we're going to apply to that frequency. So just with these 2 controls, we can affect the sound in the same way that we did with the graphic. The width control that we've got there is the amount of frequencies that are going to be affected around it. So that's the bandwidth or Q setting. And then the level control that's down here, that's the overall level of the unit, the output, okay? But like I say, the 2 that we're going to look at the most are these 2. So I'm just going to run another groove through it, and we'll affect the frequencies in turn. So at the moment, I've got the gain set so that it's boosting slightly, and then we can work through the frequencies here. So if I work through, so we're down at the low end here. This is the bass response. And as I come up, move into the low mid zone. Let's boost it a little bit more. Now we're moving up through the mids, up into those higher honky mids there. Let's boost it a little bit more. We're coming round, higher mids, until we eventually get up into the treble frequencies. So if we come all the way down again, you can hear I'm boosting the bass there. So now let's try cutting them. So I'm cutting, and as I work through, you can hear me cutting those frequencies in turn. So there, when we're cutting the treble, we've got a fairly dead sound. Boost the level to compensate. mids are cut there, and there we're boosting the, cutting the bass. Okay, so you can see that I've boosted the level there to compensate because we've dropped the level quite a lot. So go back, now let's get the gain back to boosting, and now because I've got the bandwidth fairly small, we're only affecting a very small amount of frequencies. Let's turn it up a little bit. So now we're really boosting quite a wide range of frequencies. And I'll boost them. So there you can hear how when we're down at the bottom, it's really affecting a lot of the low end. So the bass and the low mids. And as we work up, we're now boosting a lot of the higher mids. And now boosting the treble. Okay? So with the parametric there, you can hear how we started very low and worked around to the very high treble frequencies. And, you know, I'm not trapped by only having specific frequencies on a tone control or a graphic. On this parametric, I can just choose whatever frequency that I want to boost or cut. So that's a quick look at the different tools that we can use for shaping the tone. But how do we go about applying these tools in practice? Well, the first thing that a lot of people do is that they sit there playing in a bedroom or, you know, when they first get an amp in a band and they turn up the bass so they can feel it in the floor. Then they drop the mids, you know, so they can get rid of all those nasty notes that they don't like the sound of. And then they turn up the treble to make up for the lack of the definition that they've got. Now they've got rid of the mids. Hey presto, nice warm sound. But that's often the worst thing that you can do in a band situation. Turning up the bass can make you think you have a nice warm sound, you know, because you're getting it through the floor there, but it only travels a short distance. And if you've boosted the low volume and decreased the rest of the tone in the mids, once you get outside of that bassy zone in the floor, you're going to be left with just less overall volume and a pretty empty sound. So here I'll give you some tips on just using tone controls and EQ. First of all, make sure that you like the basic, clean, flat sound of your bass. I spent a few years when I first started out having problems with my sound, and I eventually realised that I wasn't enjoying the sound of my unaffected bass. You know, and I was always trying to sculpt a new bass sound with EQ, and that won't work. I remember playing this Fender Jazz for the first time on a gig and realising that I didn't need to touch the tone controls at all. So if you always find yourself messing with the EQ and the tone controls every time that you plug in your bass, maybe try testing out some other basses and try to find a clean tone that suits you. My next tip is use EQ and tone controls sparingly. Begin by just plugging in your bass with the tone controls flat or at 12 o'clock and try to get the tone that you want without messing with the amp. Alter your picking position and the pickup selection first before touching those tone controls. So if you're playing with a band, play with it flat like that for a while on some songs and try to set your volume correctly before touching the bass tone control. You'll find if you get the volume set correctly, the low end's going to come through anyway. Some people have the amp on fairly quiet and then just boost the bass and then they try to bring up the volume to the band level and it just starts farting and distorting because it's just too much. Set the volume first and then adjust the EQ after. So get your volume right, then you can bring up the bass tone control if you have to. Once you have the volume set correctly, if you have any problems with the sound, just try making small adjustments. You know, don't just boost the bass or the treble up full. You know, if you don't have enough warmth, try boosting the bass a little bit, get used to it for a while, and then if you need more, try a little bit more volume. Then try a little more bass, a little more volume, and so on. Also, as a really big tip, if you find yourself getting lost in the mix on stage, try boosting the mids a little, usually in the low mids area around 1 to 200 Hz. On its own, the bass might sound horrible and barky with those frequencies boosted, but in a band, you won't notice. Every instrument in a band occupies a certain tonal area, and it's often hard to find your place. Boosting those low mids can sometimes carve an opening and push you right through. So instead of boosting the volume more and more, you know, when you can't hear yourself, low mids can often do the trick. And often it can actually force you to drop the overall volume because you can end up coming through too much. I remember when I first, figured this out, this mid thing, because everybody used to talk about, oh, you can boost your mids, they're your friend, and I used to think, nah, I'll just boost the volume. And I was in a band where I was finding it hard to be heard. You know, there were a lot of members in the band, it was very loud. And when I suddenly realised that I could just boost the low mids, I'd boost them a little, and hey presto, I could just hear myself really well. And yeah, like I say, I had to drop the overall volume because everybody was like, oh God, it's getting too loud. And that was because I just didn't have the mids there originally. You know, I was turning up the volume, turning up the bass. As soon as I did that, bring the bass down a little bit, bring the volume down a little bit, boost the low mids, cut right through. So low mids can be your friend. So hopefully you now know a little more about sound and the frequencies that we occupy as bass players, and how we can use tone controls and EQ as tools in boosting and cutting those frequencies. The biggest tip to take from this lesson is to just be more subtle with using tone controls. Try to stick as close to the natural bass sound as you can and use EQ to overcome problems that you might find on certain stages and in different rooms or in different band lineups.